So to start, Dr. Gerson, would you mind presenting to us what some of the main goals and arguments of your new book are?
Sure. Here is the proofs for the book. I'm sort of proud of the picture. We can talk about the meaning of it. It's a famous modern artist from Sweden. But you can tell there, if you think about it, what's going on. Anyway, it'll be out in a few weeks. And let me give you the motivation and the main lines of argument in the book. If you read or teach, probably you do both, about Plato's Ethics, at some point you are going to be very dissatisfied with secondary literature, because frequently, especially in the English-speaking world, when somebody turns to Plato's Ethics, they start talking about Socrates, and they talk about Socratic paradoxes and try to construct a moral psychology that justifies or explains them. And if they do get around to Plato, it's always as an adumbration of Socratic ethics. The common view is that Plato doesn't add much to Socratic ethics. Let me just read you at the beginning of Henry Sidgwick's History of Ethics, which is a very influential book in the English-speaking world for a long, long time. Sidgwick says the following: "The ethics of Plato cannot properly be treated as a finished result, but rather as a continual movement from the position of Socrates towards the more complete and articulate system of Aristotle, except that there are ascetic and mystical suggestions in some parts of Plato's teaching, which find no counterpart in Aristotle, and which, in fact, disappear from Greek philosophy soon after Plato's death until they are revived and fantastically developed in Neo-Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism." I think Sidgwick's view has been very influential in the English-speaking world. And if you want to understand Plato's Ethics, go to Oxford Companion or Cambridge Companion or some other companion, or the Stanford Encyclopedia in Plato's Ethics. You'll find that it's almost always presented on the back of something called Socratic ethics. Now, I wrote, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a paper, I think it was in the Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie, on the myth of Plato's Socratic period. In fact, it is a myth. There is absolutely no evidence that there was a period of Plato's life in which he was presenting the philosophy of another philosopher other than his own, specifically Socrates. And so the claim that there is something called Socratic ethics in the dialogue, meaning the ethics of the philosopher Socrates and not Plato, is a myth. There's no evidence for it at all. In fact, all the evidence we do have, and I'll come back to that, all the evidence we do have is in support of the claim that Plato's philosophy is present in all of the dialogue. Socrates is a character presenting Plato's philosophy. And so if you want to talk about Socratic ethics or the ethics in the early dialogues or the so-called Socratic dialogues, you're really talking about Plato's ethics. And if you talk about Plato's ethics, then you have to face the question, and it's a real question, whether Plato's ethics developed or whether he had a kind of non-metaphysical phase to his ethics and then later put a metaphysical backing to it. All of that, I think, is very speculative and probably quite wrong. In fact, there's a lot of evidence supporting the opposite. So this book is about Plato's ethics. It really is about Plato's ethics, where Socrates is a character. In fact, I think for the historical Socrates, we know very little about his philosophy. We know very little about his ethics. This is Plato, wall-to-wall, dialogue to dialogue from beginning to end, without denying that Socrates was certainly an inspiration for Plato, personal inspiration. Certainly he was that. So the book is called Plato's Moral Realism. Moral realism is the view, as I'm sure you all know, that claims like something's good or bad or right or wrong or what we ought or ought not to do, have truth makers in the world. There are many varieties of moral realism. And in the first chapter of this book, I talk about some contemporary versions and try to provide a taxonomy of moral realism. But more to the point of this talk, most people, almost all people, agree that Plato was in some sense a moral realist. I leave aside those who think that we don't know what Plato thought about anything because he didn't speak in propria persona in the dialogues, and therefore we don't know if he was a moral realist or not a moral realist, or more anti-realist. I'm leaving that aside, not because it doesn't deserve to be addressed. I've addressed it elsewhere, and many other people have. I think it's a dead end. But in any case, my assumption is that Plato's philosophy is in the dialogue. It's there for inspection. And on that assumption, shared by most others, Plato is certainly a moral realist. But now here is the interesting part, and this is really the jumping off point for my book. If you ask people who are Plato scholars, and I've had a long career, I know a lot of these people, a lot of them are personal friends of mine for many, many years. And I ask them, okay, what is the truth maker or truth makers for Plato's moral realism? Which is just a straightforward question that you would ask of any moral realist. The answers I get are really, shockingly inadequate, superficial. If I could distill the main answer that I've gotten, and I've asked these questions of people whose names you all know very well. The answer is, well, it's something about human nature that makes it true that virtue is conducive to our happiness and vice is not conducive to our happiness. It's something about human nature, just as it's a fact about human nature that we can't digest grass, but we can digest, protein. And just as it's a fact about a circle that you can't square it. And that's it. That's the foundation of the moral realism. Now, that in itself is not a dumb position. Maybe that's true. But what is really remarkable, what is really amazing, is that it has no foundation in the text, whereas the real answer to the question is staring you in the face in the text in the Republic. Plato gives you the answer to the question. He, of course, doesn't use the term moral realism. That's anachronistic. But when asked the question, which would be the moral realistic question, he gives you a straightforward, decisive answer, which is not to say that it's easy or not to say that it doesn't require interpretation. But Plato's answer is not in doubt, even though you can go to contemporary works on Plato's Ethics and not find the passage even mentioned, in order to show that it's not important or irrelevant or something. It's just completely ignored. Now, before I talk about the passage, let me just situate the passage within the larger framework of the Republic. You'll recall that Glaucon and Erymantes present Socrates with a challenge. The challenge is to show that virtue is superior to its opposite, or justice is superior to injustice. Virtue is actually a stand-in for, justice is a stand-in for virtue, but justice will do. It's superior in all respects. In particular, it is intrinsically desirable, but it's also more desirable for its consequences than the alternative. And both of these have to be shown. You have to show that with respect to the intrinsic nature of justice, it is more desirable than injustice, but also with respect to the consequences. And as you all know, by the end of book 4, we get an answer to the first part of the question. We get the analogy between psychical health and physical health. And Socrates claims that justice is psychical health, and just as physical health is intrinsically desirable, so psychical health is intrinsically desirable. So the first answer to the first part of the question is that psychical health is intrinsically desirable and therefore more desirable than ill health. good health more desirable than ill health, just as physical health is intrinsically more desirable than its opposite. Okay, and that's how book 4 ends. Now, if you go back and read a lot of the, not a lot, some of the books on Plato's ethics, a lot of the articles on Plato's ethics, they write almost as if the end of book 4 is really the end of the Republic. They've solved the problem. They've explained why justice is preferred over injustice. But by the text itself, that's only the first part of the problem. And just by commonsensical perusal of the whole Republic, we aren't even halfway through the dialogue, right? And we haven't even begun to address the second part of the question, which is more beneficial justice or its opposite with respect to consequences, okay? So when we get into book 5 of the Republic, and then book 6 and book 7 and onwards, we get Plato, I think it's at 503 or 504, giving us the answer or the basis for the answer to the question, is justice beneficial? What makes it beneficial for us to be just rather than to be unjust? And the answer he gives is, it's the idea of the good that makes justice useful, beneficial. He used a number of adjectives, Chrysimon, subferon, Lucitelia he uses back in book 3. All of these are synonymous. It's the idea of the good that makes virtue beneficial, useful, okay? Now, in face of this text, it is not unreasonable to say, okay, that's what Plato says. I don't know what he means. How does an idea, the good, make virtue something beneficial to you, except stipulatively, as a matter of definition, right? If it's good for me, then it must have been the good that made it so. If it's beneficial, it must have been the good, which isn't very helpful. As a metaphysical claim, what in the world does it mean to say that good makes the virtues, and in fact, all the other forms, but let's just stick to the virtues, are beneficial to us? That, as I say, is not an unreasonable conclusion to reach. What I take to be an unreasonable conclusion, even an irresponsible one, on the part of a scholar, on the part of a student, is to look at this and pass over this text as if it doesn't exist and simply ignore it. And in fact, you'll find in most, if not all, work on Plato's ethics in the English-speaking world, this text is not even mentioned. Not even mentioned. If you look, probably many of you have already looked at the new edition of the Cambridge Companion to Plato, second edition, Richard Kraut and David Ebry, okay? If you go to the Index Locorum in this book, you will find not one reference to this passage, or not one single reference to any of the texts in which the idea of the good is discussed. Let that sink in for a bit. This is a companion to Plato. There are 15 or so authors here. And what Plato calls the unhypothetical first principle of all, and says that I have to bring this in to show that virtue's consequences, the consequences of being virtuous, are superior to those of the opposite. Now, one reference to these, not just in the articles which supposedly talk about Plato's ethics. One of the articles talks about Plato's ethics and it's called Socrates' philosophy. Another talks about the Hippias Minor, which is a small minor dialogue, as if that were the Platonic ethics, but it's really Socrates who's talking, according to the author. Now, one of them talks about the idea of the good as relevant to the ethics, much less the idea of the good as relevant to the metaphysics, right? If you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia, or if you go to, say, the Oxford Companion to Plato, and you look at the article on Plato's metaphysics, the article on Plato's metaphysics talk about Plato's theory of forms. Fair enough. but not one word, not a single footnote in which what Plato calls the unhypothetical first principle of all, the good, is mentioned. Now, one would think that a book or an article on Plato's metaphysics or Plato's ethics would at least address what Plato says, and not just says en passant, but says in about 20 passages in the Republic, to say nothing of the Philebus or the Parmenides or the Phaedo or elsewhere. Not even mentions what Plato calls the arche ton panton, the principle, the starting point of everything. It's as if you picked up the companion to Thomas Aquinas and you went into the index and you looked up God and there was no reference. You think, what kind of companion to Aquinas is this, in which nobody even talks about God? We don't need that to talk about Aquinas. I mean, it's really strange, isn't it? I mean, it leads you to think, you know, daring thoughts, psychological or sociological or political or ideological. I mean, it's hard to grapple with this within the norms of ordinary scholarship and evidence and what counts as historical evidence and how we evaluate the evidence, how we interpret the evidence, because they refuse to look at the evidence. Okay? They refuse to countenance it. They simply ignore it. It doesn't exist. What are you talking about? There's a very famous Plato scholar. I'll stop with this and go back to the details of the book in a moment. There's a very famous Plato scholar, and now no longer with us. And I said to him about Plato says twice that the idea of the good is the unhypothetical, unhypotheton, first principle of all. And he said, does Plato say that? It sort of leaves you speechless, really, doesn't it? The book is about Plato's moral realism, the truthmaker for Plato's moral realism, which is the idea of the good, and how that is so. Okay. I talk a lot about the idea of the good in the Republic and elsewhere. I talked some about the evidence relating to Plato's idea of the good from Aristotle and elsewhere, though I've written a book on that, so I really only pick up a little bit of that in the book. And then I talk about other theories of ethics, Plato's ethics, and their inadequacy in relation to the arguments of the Republic and elsewhere. Okay, so let me just say now what I've tried to achieve in this book in relation to moral realism and the truthmaker for Plato's moral realism. Okay. As I said, it's the good that Plato says makes virtues beneficial or useful. This guy does that. Okay. And pondering that, we have to try to understand what Plato or how Plato describes this first principle of all. We have at least make a stab at it. And one of the main things he says is that the idea of the good is epekina tesousias. It's above ousia. It's not nothing, but it doesn't have an ousia. It isn't an ousia. It's above ousia, which a number of North American scholars, and there are some European scholars too, just throw up their hands and say, well, if it's above ousia, it's nothing, and it's a mystical claim. It's funny that those who deny that Plato has an esoteric teaching find a lot of esotericism in the dialogue, particularly relating to the good. Anyway, one very good question is, why must the idea of the good, the first principle of all, the unhypothetical first principle of all, the basis for our answer to the question why it pays, has to be addressed. Okay. Now, to say that psychical health is good, as is physical health, is not a problematic claim. sort of low-hanging fruit. I bet when you first read Book 4 of the Republic, you were probably a little disappointed because you were expecting some more bang out of that. And all you get is that being mentally healthy is a good thing. We all know that, just as being physically healthy is a good thing, okay? However, most of what ethics is about is not discovering what kinds of things human beings find to be good. That's not really very hard. It's probably less than 10, right? You know, pleasure, friendship, physical health, psychical health, satisfying activity, security. I'm beginning to run out of possibilities. This is the same in every culture. It's been at every time. This is what human beings find are good. That's not what ethics is about. Ethics is about conflicts among goods. When one or more good has to be sacrificed for another. Okay. So you can say, although it sounds paradoxical, and Plato likes to sound paradoxical, it really isn't paradoxical to say, yes, this is a good, but in this circumstance, it isn't the good, or it isn't good for me, right? A very good example of a conflict, let's just stick within the dialogues, is Socrates himself, who in the Crito has to decide between the good of his physical health, well-being, his life, and the good of his psychical health, which he thinks would be damaged by escaping, because he thinks he has been, judged by a legitimate jury to be guilty, and laws which he himself accepts. That kind of conflict is, I take it, sort of the substance of normative thinking, making these choices, making deliberations. Various ethical theories purport to give us some sort of technique or device or heuristic for making these decisions about some very specific actions. Okay. Socrates, of course, chooses in the Crito to opt for his health, psychical health, over his physical health. And he says, I think it's at 49D, 49C, one must never do an unjust deed. He makes an absolutist claim. And that's really relevant to this book and to the whole question of Platonic ethics, because it's very difficult without a metaphysical context to explain this absolutist claim, right? Even if it is for the most part true that certain sorts of behavior is beneficial, say being honest, telling the truth, it's easy enough to come up with examples, and not just as exotic examples, in which it isn't, in which lying will be better for you than not lying, or in which something which is otherwise good has to be sacrificed for something else, okay? For those who eschew metaphysics in talking about Socrates' ethics and make Plato's metaphysics simply an unnecessary adumbration of Socratic ethics, they really don't have an answer to the question of Socrates' absolutism. They don't have a question as to why it is never, ever in your interest to do something that is not virtuous, because the good eternally makes virtue beneficial to you. Okay, so going back to the question of why the good is above ousia, if we face the conflict in ethics and we want to know how to resolve it, if you make, and we want to resolve it by doing what's good for ourselves, that's what we aim to do. There's no way to resolve it if the good is identified with some sort of ousia, right? Because if it's identified with some sort of ousia, it's going to be focused on one good rather than another. Here's what I mean. Let's say, and this is Plato's main example of confusing the good with a particular ousia. Let's say the good is pleasure. Okay. First of all, it's always possible to ask whether a pleasure that is good for me. In the Gorgias and the Philebus, Socrates takes on Callicles and he takes on Protagoras to show that something may be a good, but in certain circumstances it isn't good for me because it conflicts with another good. So if you identify the good, the source of benefit in the virtues, with a particular ousia, you have no basis, you've eliminated the basis for adjudicating amongst goods. because if you identify with one good, you're still going to have to compare it with another good or other goods as to which one is, in fact, a manifestation of the good in the circumstance. So the good has to be above ousia, not because it's some mystical goal, but because if there is a truth maker for moral realism, it can't be identified with a particular kind of content. And ousia is another word for, or content is another word for ousia. So the good has to be above ousia, and it has to make things good for the person who wants only what's good for himself, unequivocally, universally, without qualification. Okay, now that's a big job, a big claim. Sometimes people say if the good is above ousia, then it's nothing. It has no content, and so it is irrelevant to ethics. I think that's the opposite of the truth. It has to be without a particular kind of content to be relevant to ethics. It has to be universally what it is, just as, here's an analogy, mathematical truths are mathematically universally true if they're true, right? They aren't true in one place, but not in another, at one time or not another time. And if the good is actually what makes something good or bad, indirectly by being what makes a virtue good or bad, and so a particular virtuous deed, good or bad, a particular deed, virtuous or vicious, that is good or bad, then it is universally so. In other words, if something is going to be good for me, that's because it's good. And if it's good for me. It's not possible now to put it more concretely, it's not possible that my good should be realized at your expense. Just as it's not possible that I should arrive at the correct answer to the question, how much is 4 plus 3? And you should arrive at the correct answer, but come up with a different answer from me. It's not possible. Certainly Plato doesn't think it's possible. So good is good. In other words, my good is never achieved at your expense, nor your good at my expense. Now, if you think about that as a heuristic, as a criterion, I think your view will be, before long, that far from being, insubstantial, Plato's claim is actually way too large, way too substantial, because most people think that many goods are achieved, if not with, disaster for someone else, at least with some detriment to someone else. Especially in politics. If you agreed with Plato on this point, as I've interpreted him, if you agreed with him, you would have to say that no political policy could be good if it's bad for anybody. Think about that for a minute. Let me give you an example, a really relatively small example, but you'll be able to see the principle underlying this example and the extraordinary claim that's being made here. Not that it's wrong or that it's right, but I just want you to see what the claim is that in my view, Plato makes. Take a minimum wage law, okay? Even the most ardent proponents of minimum wage laws acknowledge that some people will be harmed by that. Some people whose marginal productivity falls below what the minimum wage would be. Even if they are few, the employers will fire them because paying them the minimum wage isn't in their interest. As I say, even the most ardent supporters of a minimum wage law would agree that some people are harmed, but they'll be very quick to say the majority of people will be benefited. Okay? A utilitarian calculation. But if Plato is right, it can't be good for anybody that a law is bad for somebody. And if the minimum wage law is bad for somebody, it can't be good for anybody. And once you sort of internalize that principle, or realize what the principle is, you begin to think there are hardly any laws, any public policies that don't at least countenance the negative effects on some small segment of the population. Okay, now you might say, okay, if you're a utilitarian, we factor in this, but just got a call from a family member. I forgot to turn off my phone. Okay. 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 So if we take a utilitarian approach, you might say everything we do has negative and positive effects, but you have to weigh up the positive against the negative, and the common good is achieved by the positive. And we have to settle and accept the negative effects. I'm not here to argue for or against utilitarianism. I just want to claim, I want to argue that this is not Plato's view. And if this view of Plato's is true, then it's hard to countenance any contemporary political arrangement in which utilitarian considerations are the daily fare, that would be just, that would be acceptable. Okay, so I spend a long time in the book in talking about this as a heuristic. Claim that you must never do an unjust deed to someone else in order to benefit yourself. And what this means, both in a contemporary context, but also in the context of Plato's ethics and his own politics. But there's a second criterion that we can appeal to in applying the rule about the idea of the good as the unhypothetical first principle law and the sorts of benefit, the virtues, and our lives. And that is something that Plato says in Book 4, and he repeats in a number of places in the Republic and elsewhere. He says the virtuous person becomes one out of many. You remember that from Book 4? Again, you'll hardly find any discussions of what that means. And if you turn to the political claims he makes in the Republic, he says the same thing about polis, right? The polis is good or healthy when it's unified, and when stasis comes in the polis, tearing apart the polis is bad, right? In the taxonomy of decline in Book 8 and 9 of the Republic, and the aristocratic man and the aristocratic polis, to the tyrannical man and the tyrannical polis, it is a taxonomy of disunity or disassembly of the parts to lead to the opposite, right? And so the aristocratic man and the aristocratic polis turns out to be ideally unified according to kind, whether it's a polis, which exists by nature, or whether it's a human being, or whether it's a family. All of these natural kinds for Plato have a kind of unity, which is an index of whether the good is being achieved. Okay, at which point now there's another interesting exegetical and historical philosophical issue that arises. How do we get from good to unity? If the good is what makes things beneficial, how did we get to an index of goodness is unity? Okay, now, those people who've been educated in Europe, or in some places in Europe, I guess, won't be so puzzled by this question as those who've been educated in North America. because those who've been educated in North America are probably have now been exposed to the mass of evidence, beginning with Aristotle and carrying on for hundreds of years in the indirect tradition, that, as Aristotle says, Plato identified the good with the one. Now, I won't go into the details of that evidence. There's a nice conference in Krakow at the end of June, in which we're going to go through all of the evidence over the course of 5 days and have a number of papers on the various aspects of the evidence. You may want to look that up, and you may want to zoom in for some of that. But according to all this evidence, Plato identifies the good with the one, and the one, not the number one, of course, not the form of one, because it's not an ousia. The oneness is an index of goodness, because that's what goodness is, as manifested in the integrated unities of the kinds of things here below: states, families, individuals, and indeed non-human animals and other living things in the cosmos as a whole. Okay. There are lots of places in the dialogues in which Plato talks about unity as an ideal, which leaves people puzzled, because they have in principle, excluded this evidence from their understanding of Plato. Okay. I think there's a real watershed and a real divide among Plato scholars for those who think that we have to take all the evidence available and we have to evaluate it and critically evaluate it and not just accept it at face value, and those who simply refuse to countenance evidence because they don't like where the evidence is leading. Okay, I might mention something here about Hunter Biden's laptop, but maybe that'll take us too far off course. Okay, in any case, I'm with those who think that we should take the evidence seriously, and the evidence tells us that when Plato talks about the good, he's talking about the one. We could talk about the indefinite diet if you want for this time. Talk about the good, he's talking about the one. And the second index of goodness in practical ethics is unity, as an indication of whether something is good or not. There's a third, and then I'll more or less stop and try to answer the questions. We can have discussions. There's a lot more in the book, but this is the main idea. It's one that comes up in the Philetus quite explicitly. Again, something that isn't talked about in the literature about Plato's ethics, hardly at all. Even books and papers on the Philetus don't talk about this much, where he says if we want to know the good, we can't capture it in itself because it's above ousia, presumably. But there's a threefold criterion, which, when we think of them together as if they were one, that will give us an indication of what the good is. He says symmetry and beauty and truth. And if you find symmetry and beauty and truth together, truth, of course, is ontological truth. Truth, by the way, which comes from the idea of the good and provided to the forms, and therefore indirectly provided to other things. They have as much being as they have truth. When you have joined these three together, you have a pretty good indication that good is being manifested. Okay. Now, with all three of these criteria, that is not to suggest that Plato has a absolutely ubiquitous, that's not the word I mean, a criterion or a set of criteria by which to solve every moral problem. Okay, simply apply these criteria on whether it's good or bad or right or wrong. I think there are reasons for that, and I've discussed some of them in the book. And actually, I think it's a feature of the system, not a bug, that Plato doesn't have a system that is supposed to answer easily every single ethical question, as, for example, utilitarianism does. You just calculate where the greatest happiness of the greatest number is, and you've got an answer to the question. No problem. It's quite the opposite of that. And I suppose that's in part why Plato thinks that discovering the good as a superordinate first principle of all is a big deal. And though I think he sort of exaggerates when he talks about a education that goes actually some 50 years and begins in utero in order to reach the idea of the good. he may be exaggerating somewhat, but I think it's an indication that understanding the good as what unifies all of the forms and what makes everything else good and beneficial for us is not an easy thing to do. And the last thing I'll say is, that being the case, I think Plato is a little more confident that with this knowledge, you would have a basis for a political order. Because even if someone did know the good and knew what was good in this particular situation in the polis with respect to state buildings or with respect to law or with respect to war or other issues in a polis, as Plato knew full well, communicating knowledge is practically impossible, at least directly, because all you can do is say what you think, and someone may accept it and may not. But politics has to deal with apparent good, not real good. Metaphysics deals with real good, politics deals with apparent good. And so I think Plato goes way, way too far in his politics. But that's another chapter in the book, on the basis of his own principles. So Plato's moral realism is rooted in his metaphysics. That's the main message of the book. And the metaphysics has as its first principle of all, this is, I think, not controversial, alas. Some people just ignore it, but it's not really controversial. The first principle of all is the idea of the good, which is above ousia, which is the source of knowability for the forms, which gives them truth, which flows out, as Plato says, at pyrrhuton. It just flows out from the good to everything else. When we talk about Plato's ethics, and even when we talk about the Socratic paradoxes, we either have to set it within this metaphysical framework, and I try to do that for a number of dialogues, like the Lysis, for example, and the Gorgias and Protagoras, or we're going to condemn ourselves to having a rather arbitrary reconstruction of something that isn't Plato. A Socratic ethics, which turns out to be prudentialist, in which Socrates' commitment to virtue is like an old saw, honesty is the best policy, or you have to be a friend to make a friend, or things like that. In other words, Xenophon's Socrates, not Plato's Socrates. I think that's wrong exegetically. I think it's philosophically inept, but that's a very, very common view. So I see, I've talked for about 45 minutes now, so let me stop. I'll try to answer your questions. I'll try to elaborate on some of the points I made, but there it is.
Very good. Thank you for that. So now if anybody has questions, just use the raise hand function and I will go to some people. So Thomas, why don't you go ahead and lead us off?
Hi, Thomas.
Thank you. I was glad you ended with the syllabus, because that was what I was thinking about the whole time you were talking, or a good deal of the time you were talking. And I was also thinking of another passage in a little bit earlier in Book 6 of the Republic. I think this is around 506e.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the good being beyond being, or the idea of the good being beyond being, is a little bit later than that, 509b or something.
509b, yeah.
And the earlier passage, Socrates is saying, well, he's sort of apologizing. He says, I don't know about this. I can give you my opinion, but I will not be speaking on the basis of knowledge. And therefore, I guess I'm less confident than you are that the statements that follow are Socrates' final position or Plato's final position. Like you, I don't see much use in being too precise about that in this conversation. And therefore, my tendency in reading the Philebus passage, and I had it open, so I put it in the chat. His statement is, if we are not able to hunt after the idea of the good in one thing, then we should do this other thing. Your reading was something like, well, the idea of the good is beyond being. It is something, and we can have access to it. My reading of that passage, or a possible reading, would be something like, due to some considerations that I argue are presented in the syllabus, you can be confident that there is not an idea of the good in the way expected or hoped, something like that.
Wow.
So that's,
Okay.
I can't justify such a reading just in asking my question, but
Right.
without having you to buy into all of that, how do you address that passage in the Republic?
Okay,
I
let me
mentioned,
say,
which is that just exegetically, the fact that Socrates himself
mhm.
is, caveating what follows
Right.
to some extent.
Okay. Thanks, Thomas. First of all, I said the good is epekinetes ousias, and I kept using the word ousia because one translation is being, but the word being in English doesn't mean what ousia means in Greek. Ousia is a juridical term, and it has to do with your stuff, which is bounded by horoi, the stones around your property. All your stuff is what is inside the horoi. So it's mine and not yours. It has a limit to it. Okay. Ousia is a principle of limitation. And if you think about it as being in the sense, the English word of existing, which is one of the meanings of being, then you're really going to be thrown off, because Plato says that the idea of the good is oidamonestaton to ontos, the happiest of that which is. He also says it's the brightest phanoteton of that which is. So even if you deny being of the good, whatever you mean by being, you can't deny existence of the good. That's the first thing, by the text itself. Okay. And the good also provides enai and ousia to the forms. Okay. It can't be nothing to provide it. It's not nothing that does it. He also says it exceeds everything else in dunamis, right? Dunaton, in duname. If you go to the sophist, what do we find there? When he's talking about the materialists and the idealists and the pluralists and the monists, he offers to the materialists and the idealists a kind of mollifying criterion of being, because they couldn't quite pin down what it meant to be, which is dunamis, right? It's an horos of being, that it has dunamis, to do or have anything done to it. And in the Republic, he has said the idea of the good exceeds everything else in dunamis, which there's a good indication that it's not nothing. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, whether Socrates knows, Socrates is just Plato's character, right? He's just a character in the play. And he doesn't know what Plato doesn't want the reader to know that Plato knows, because what Plato knows is here quite irrelevant, right? If I know the answer to these questions, you're not going to accept what I say just because I say it, right? You're only going to accept it if it's true. But if you know that it's true, you don't need to say it. So Socrates is in principle ignorant. He has somebody who adduces knowledge from his reader, the midwife analogy, the midwife metaphor, and the Theaetetus. And so his knowledge or ignorance about these things are really neither here nor there. But you may recall that when he finishes that little passage that you rightly focus on, right before he goes to the divided line, he says something really quite important. He says, Svodra ge apolepo. I'm really leaving out a lot. I'm really leaving out a lot here. Okay? Now, that's not the words of somebody who's ignorant. That's the words of an author who's indicating to the reader that this is just a sketch of the idea of the good, which is something that we're talking about in the academy every day, which is something I'm thinking about and writing about every day. And there's a lot more to say about it. And why should we be confident that it means that? Because the evidence of people who were with it, Plato, including Aristotle, and those who were students of Aristotle, and those who have the texts of Chrysippus and Xenocrates, all the way going up to Proclus, who have these texts, have Plato talking about the good and the one at great length. So if we focus on the Greek, And if we pay attention to all the text, we can't say that the good is nothing. We can't say it's beyond being in the sense of tomedamos on of the sophist, absolutely nothing, which we have to exclude. We can't say anything about. Far from it. It's not that. It's beyond finite being, if you will, if you want to use the word being. And it is the unhypothetical principle of everything. That's what he says twice. So to exclude it from the metaphysics seems to me sort of like malpractice. It's like, going into a mud fight and then going to do surgery, right? Without, disinfecting yourself. It's malpractice. It's incompetence. If you really think you're talking about Plato's metaphysics and you ignore what he says is the starting point of my metaphysics, just as I said about Aquinas. If you leave out God and talk about Aquinas's metaphysics, or talk about Aquinas' theology, or his theology in relation to the metaphysics, and you leave out God, what is the motive for doing this? I think that's the question. It's not that you have an argument, but that's the question. What is the motive?
Well, thank you. I was happy to elicit even more of your viewpoint on that. So, but I'll leave the rest aside for now.
Very good. All right, we'll go to Marcus next.
Marcus.
First, I want to say thank you for coming, Professor Gerson. We're all very glad to have you on here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. My question has to do with the relationship between the good as a universal, as you describe it in the first heuristic, and the particular. I was thinking, okay, the good is universal, so that means it has to be good for everyone, it has to be good in every possible way. That's what it means to be universal. But the particular action, just because it's a particular, why does it have to have that same kind of universality in order to participate in the idea of the good? And I'm thinking,
well, because I think the mathematical analogy is very helpful here. If I have four coins in my left pocket and 3 coins in my right pocket, they will manifest the eternal truth that 4 and 3 are 7. Okay, and there's no room for difference, right? And I know that if you have 4 coins in your pocket and 4 coins in the other pocket, there'll be 7 as well. That's what universality is. There are no exceptions. So if the idea of the good is manifested in my action, let's say my charitable deed or my just deed or my paying my debts or whatever it is, it can't be bad anywhere else in the world that the good is manifested here. Just as it can't be true that 4 plus 3 is other than 7 anywhere in the world if I recognize it as 7. That's the analogy I would stand on. I think that's the one that Plato would rely on. As you know, he uses lots of mathematical analogies, and he thinks mathematical is a very powerful heuristic in understanding the universality of forms.
yes, but what if we compare it to something like beauty in the Symposium? Beauty is absolutely good everywhere to everyone. It can't appear to be anything but beautiful, but any particular thing does not appear that way, appear the way beauty does, simply because it's not the beautiful itself. It's shares in beauty.
Since the good is above ousia, manifestations of the good are going to be in ousia, or in the diminished ousia of the sensible world. Sure. Right? So it's not the case that you're going to, let's say you do a virtuous deed, and that's good. It's a specific virtuous deed at a time and place, is all the particularity is there, but it's a manifestation of what is universally the case. That is the eternal relationship between good and virtue, which is manifested here below. So it's indirect relationship. Okay, that's true, but that, I mean, as a criticism of the theory, it doesn't seem to me to get very far, since Plato's already argued why the first principle of all has to be above ousia. And so if moral realism is true, we have to countenance the first principle of all being manifest in a variety of ways, just as beauty is. Although beauty is an ousia, Helen's beauty is different from the beauty of a mathematical theorem. Okay, these are variously manifested. Beauty itself is, I think, and we can talk about this maybe another time, beauty itself is a property of being, the property of attracting us. property of drawing us to it, just as truth is a property of being, the property of being intelligible to us. And so beauty draws us to the good, as he says in the Republic, right? Our love of the beautiful is nothing but our desire for happiness, which is just the desire for the good. And so beauty is a attractor. That's not the word I want. It is a source of our attraction to the good, because that's always that's why it's an important criterion in the Philebus. It is always a question that someone might raise. Okay, you're right. The good is the first principle of all and makes things good. But why should I care about the good? I mean, why should I want it? Right? What does Milton's Satan say? What's his emblem that he has on his t-shirt? Right? Evil be thou my good. That's what Satan says, right? You got it. I actually saw a kid at the athletic center here at the U of T. I had the t-shirt that said, evil be thou my good. And my first instinct was to go back to class, and I was teaching a 200 second-year course in ancient philosophy with about 150 people in it. And my first instinct was to go back to class and say, women, do not date this guy, right? To beware, do not date this guy. Anyway, why not? Why not say evil be thou my good? And one of Plato's answers, one of his really spectacular answers, I think, is found in his analysis and reflection on beauty. Because we are drawn to beauty, everyone is drawn to beauty, the beautiful. And Plato says this is a path to the good. Right? Don't think you can have the beautiful without the good. Tolstoy was completely puzzled by the fact that people associate beautiful and the good. And he thought these have nothing to do with each other. Because beauty is one thing, goodness is another thing. They're just completely, it's apples and oranges. And Plato thought just the opposite. He thought that beauty is in the nature of things, a kind of guide, a pathway to the good. Even physical beauty is a pathway to the good. And this is clear in the Symposium. I think it's clear in the Philebus, it's clear in Phaedrus, it's clear in many, many places. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
Very good. So I actually have a question. I'm wondering, just as a textual question about the book, how much does it differ from or build on your chapter in your naturalism book on Plato's Ethics and the Good?
It's a considerable expansion on that. It really is. The whole book is about, I'll tell you. Okay, so there are 8 chapters. There's an explanation of moral realism in the first chapter and Platonism. The second chapter is on the idea of the good, quite extensive. Then virtue, knowledge, and the good. Socratic versus Platonic ethics, in which you argue that there is no such thing as Socratic ethics versus Platonic ethics. The chapter on moral responsibility, a very vexed issue in Plato and in ancient philosophy generally. There's a separate chapter on the Philebus and statesmen, and finally a chapter on morality, religion, and politics, concentrating on the laws and the statesmen. No, the laws, that's the other chapter, concentrating mostly on the laws and what Plato has to say there. So it goes far beyond that chapter in that book, focusing on the ethics. If in writing this book, I made a good faith effort to read all the literature on Plato's Ethics. I'm sure I failed. I'm sure I missed some things, but I read a lot of stuff. I think I read all the stuff that anybody would ever mention or think of reading. And I went into some pretty obscure corners in English, as well as other languages, but especially in English on Plato's Ethics. There actually is not a lot, if you think about it. There's not a lot of people who write saying, I'm talking about Plato and his ethics. There's not a lot on it. And of those who talk about the metaphysical foundation of his ethics, we're down shrunk to a very, very small bibliography. Very small. It's really quite shocking. One of the results of my research is how little real serious work there is on Plato's ethics. with the text of Plato's dialogues, say nothing of the indirect evidence, testimony of Aristotle and others, very, very little evidence. Ever since, I think it's Vlastos, who really had a malign effect on this, his influence on his students and on others to make Socratic ethics the substitute for Platonic ethics, and then to say, as he does, that Socratic ethics is innocent of metaphysics, right? Socrates sub E, remember, and Socrates sub M, Socrates in the early dialogue, Socrates in the middle dialogues. Socrates sub E is no metaphysician. And it was, of course, Socrates sub E that he wanted to defend, where Socrates sub M, Socrates in the middle dialogues, is gone off the rails. And he's saying things that are foolish, saying things that are unnecessary, that pollute the beauty and the integrity of Socratic ethics. A lot of people have been influenced by that view, including some very good friends of mine. And I think it's worthless, exegetically, as a matter of history of philosophy. Let's leave aside the important question of whether it's right or wrong, Socratic ethics, but as exegesis of Plato, as historical philosophy, I think it's practically worthless. There's no evidence for it. It's just it's hagiography, Socratic hagiography, turning into this mythical character, turning him into a religious figure, who must be held innocent of the metaphysical extravagances of Plato. Remember, Gilbert Ryle said that Plato was too good of a philosopher to be a Platonist. That's the whereas Platonism means the metaphysics. That's the mindset of many, many people, especially in North America, who read on Plato's Ethics.
Let me just ask one more quick follow-up, and then we'll go to Carson. So it seems like one of the arguments you give against that Vlastos type reading is this big emphasis on Aristotle's testimony that Plato had since his youth a two-world metaphysics.
Right.
Could you go into a little bit more detail on how why we should take that claim seriously? Because I've heard from many people that Aristotle was a terrible historian of philosophy, we shouldn't take these judgments seriously, etc.
Okay. The sentence in Alpha 6 of the Metaphysics, which begins ek neu, starting from his youth, right? It's not in his youth, that would be ek neo. Ek neu, starting from his youth. Plato hung around, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, hung around with the Cratylus and others, and he came to the view that there was no knowledge of the sensible world. And then he held that, the knowledge must be of the intelligible world. Okay. In other words, and he supported this view later on too. That is, I take that to mean he doubled down on this view. He provided arguments for it, like the difference between philosophers and lovers and sights and sounds in the Republic. He gave arguments for this view. He didn't just hold it, he had arguments. Okay. Now, Aristotle's testimony is that Plato had two-world metaphysics. Okay. Starting from his youth. And in Neos, as you probably know, Xenophon tells us this, or is it Socrates? It's Xenophon. He says, calling someone over 30 a Neos is an insult. You're really belittling them. This is a guy in his 20s. Okay. So Plato in his 20s held a two-world metaphysics, which means he probably held this view before he wrote any dialogues, almost certainly before he wrote any dialogues, even before Socrates died, probably. Okay. And he continued to hold it for the rest of his life. Okay. Now, if this is the case, first of all, this sentence is one of the few sentences that Harold Chernus accepts. And there's no more fierce critic of Aristotle's historical testimony than Chernus. But he sees no reason to doubt it because Plato did hold two-world metaphysics. Okay? Why would he doubt that the man who spent 20 years with Plato was just reporting what Plato's view was, when that view can be correlated in the dialogues? But what might seem contentious is the claim, which comes out of nowhere, that there are early, middle, and late dialogues. In the early dialogues, Plato wasn't expressing his own view, but the views of Socrates. Okay? And that sometime later on, he left Socrates and expressed his own view. Okay, as in the Philebus and Theaetetus, where Socrates is the main interlocutor, but that doesn't count as Socratic dialogues. Those don't count because they don't fit into the picture. Interestingly enough, Vlastos accepts this sentence too. But guess what? He leaves out the first two words, ek neu. He goes ... Plato was with the Crowleans, and then he didn't believe there was knowledge of the sensible world. Okay, isn't that odd? He leaves out the only two words that would, read ordinary Greek, undercut his entire approach to Socrates, which, as he says in Socrates' moralist and ironic philosopher, ironist and moral philosopher, something like that, right? He says, the fundamental principle of my hermeneutics is that Plato never says anything in any dialogue that he, Plato, does not believe at the time of writing that dialogue. So he believes Socrates of the early dialogues. Plato presents Socrates in the early dialogues holding a view that Plato himself held. In other words, a non-metaphysical view. So if you leave in the words ek neu, that completely undermines Vlastos's claim that Plato at the beginning, some unspecified early period, didn't hold a two-world metaphysic view, but he held the Socratic view. And he only deviated from it later on. Okay, so I don't think the question is why should we trust Aristotle, but why should we trust Vlastos?
That was a great answer. Thank you. That definitely helps to clear up some of the thoughts that I've had. Let's go over to Carson now. Let's see what Carson has to say.
Thank you, Professor.
Hi, Carson.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. So I read the handout you distributed, which was a kind of outline of what you're going to be talking about in your book. It seems like you talk a lot about Platonic interpretation and how people just aren't seeing what's right in front of them, and that they're missing the obvious fact that Plato's
I don't think they're missing it. I think they read it and then they pass on.
Okay.
Right? I mean, they're embarrassed by it. And I've heard people say to me they're embarrassed by it.
Right.
They don't know what to do with it. It's like walking in on your parents having sex. I mean, it's you just don't want to see this, right? You wish you could unsee it.
Yeah.
And that's how they look at this text. But that's not the way to do the history of philosophy. That's just not the way to do the history of philosophy.
Yeah, and you talk about how, I mean, pretty much everyone, says Plato's a moral realist of some sort. So when you talk about people that do recognize it, some of them have a problem with it because, once you have this idea of the good, how are we supposed to use it to practically guide our actions? How is it useful for ethics just to say that, well, there's this absolute first principle. Okay, now what do I do? So you raise that problem of people who recognize it, but then say, well, how is it really going to help me as a guide for ethics? And then what you seem to do is offer three responses to that problem of how it could be a guide. The three heuristics, the first one being universality, the second one being integrative unity, the third one being truth, beauty, and the other one from the Philebus. Do you think, it sounds like you don't think the first one works, is that correct?
No, absolutely not. I think the first one is the most important for practical ethics, right? Which is not to say it's infallible, right? Rabbi Hillel said, when asked to explain the Torah while standing on one foot, just what's the whole point of it? He said it's simple. Do not do to others what is hateful to yourself. It was a practical guide he gave them. And that's exactly the first heuristic, right? Don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. That's not an infallible guide. Maybe there are occasions in which very complicated behavior would yield a better result than the result that seems to be obvious. But for the most part, that's a good way to go through life, don't you think? Don't you agree? Don't do to others what's hateful to yourself. And that's a heuristic. But what Plato gives you is a metaphysical explanation of why that is a heuristic.
But you bring
Don't you agree? Don't you agree that's a good way to live?
Yes, you bring up
Okay.
the objection of politics, though, and that seemed to undermine the heuristic because
No, it doesn't undermine the heuristic. It just says that the heuristic is an ethical heuristic, and politics is not reducible to metaphysics. But that's in the last chapter of the book, and that's a long story, because I think politics has to do with the apparent good, not the real good.
so politics is the final end of politics. It doesn't connect to the ultimate good.
Only indirectly, because of course we all want to be happy. We all want what's really good for us. As Plato says at 505D of the Republic, people are prepared to accept apparent justice and apparent beauty, but nobody accepts apparent good. Everybody wants the real good. True. And the metaphysics, that explains how that's the case is in the Republic. However, even the virtuous person can only do what appears to himself to be good. The difference between the virtuous person and the non-virtuous person is that what appears to the virtuous person to be good really is good. But it's not because it appears to him to be so that it's really good, right? There's no inference from, it appears to me to be so-and-so, that it really is so-and-so. And in politics, you have to deal with appearances, even among good people, because the connection between how things appear to me and how they really are is an epistemological one, and there is no necessary connection, but the connection between the good and a manifestation of the good is a metaphysical one. And so there's a break there. And as a ruler, even if the ruler is the demos, even if the ruler are the people, the majority ruler, they can only do what appears to them to be good. That's all anybody can do. And they have to deal with people to whom the good appears differently. It appears otherwise. And you have to decide at some point whether you're going to inflict your view of the good on others, or whether you're going to acknowledge what they think is the good and not do what Rabbi Hillel says you shouldn't do, which is what's hateful to yourself, to have someone impose their view on you. So it's a very different view about how politics ought to go, without denying the truth of this first heuristic.
So if you use the other heuristic and say the political whole is some kind of integrative unity, like the second heuristic says, would you say it's only an apparent integrative unity of the whole?
No. That's a metaphysical one too. But an apparent unity requires consent by everybody, right? I mean, that's the unity. So you don't have stasis, right? I like the approach of the Amish very much. When kids get to be, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, maybe some of you are or know more than I do. When kids get to be 17 or 18, they're forced to leave the community and go out on their own for a period of time, because they don't want to impose on them things the kids don't want. So go out into the world and see if you think it's better there. And if you agree that it's better with us in the community, we welcome you joyfully to return. Okay, so the absolute exigency of consent is manifest in the Amish community, and I think it's a very admirable thing. The larger and larger you get, the more and more diverse the people are, the harder and harder this is to achieve. And the the political unforgivable sin is to think that your view of what is the good should dominate, especially when you have such a diverse population like Athens,
What if
like the US, or
the
like
other
any
side's view of the good is not integrative unity, but a pure plurality? Then it seems like you would need
No,
to.
the Amish community would be an integrated unity that all are in sync about how to live, how to interact with each other. There's not necessarily one way of integrating the unity, but the unity meaning the absence of stasis.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I would think that you said Paulus is a natural kind, and all natural kinds have some sort of integrated unity, and all integrated unities are manifestations of the metaphysical good. So I don't see how it's just an apparent good. But your first,
Sure, no, of course not. It would be a real good, but epistemologically speaking, you can only do what appears to you to be good, even if, as a matter of fact, what appears to you to be good really is so. It isn't so because it appears to you to be good. S believes P doesn't entail P, right? There's a fundamental point. Maybe it's being lost somewhere in the idea that there are truths as opposed to truth. And if you believe something is true, then it's true. But of course it isn't, right? The mental institutions are filled with people who believe that they're Napoleon or that can fly or that they're immortal and so on, right? Believing it doesn't make it so. But all you can do is what you believe, in hopes that you can refine your beliefs and actually hit on the truth. This is what Plato says in Meno. Okay, but in politics, you have to deal with the facts on the ground, which are what people's beliefs are. Even though you say of somebody, I think his belief is false, I have to acknowledge that it's his belief. And if I don't acknowledge it's his belief, I've begun to sow the seeds of stasis.
okay. Just one last thing. The first heuristic seems to assume universality. It doesn't really give an argument for it. The second heuristic, when it talks about integrated,
The argument for the universality of good,
right?
the argument is that all intelligible being is universal. This isn't, logical universal. It means the eternal world is always and everywhere the same, right? It doesn't change. There's nothing that could change it. Good is good. Circularity is circularity because it's eternal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I won't say anymore, but I appreciate your responses.
Thanks.
Very good. All right, Marcus.
Yes, I wanted to go back to Aristotle for just a minute and ask you about these places that Vlastos will appeal to. He says he'll point to like where Aristotle says that Socrates denied the possibility of acrasia, for example, seeming to make a distinction between the early dialogues in the middle.
Right.
What do you make of that kind of thing?
Maybe Socrates did, but the dialogue, the literary character is not Socrates. The historical Socrates, we have believed that. Aristotle makes a clear distinction between the Socratic character and the historical figure. And even with the historical figure, and even if Aristotle's testimony is accurate, and I take it to be accurate, we don't know why Socrates believed the things he believed. The historical figure. We don't know why.
Right. So
there's no evidence at all as to why he believed the things he did. Now, the literary Socrates, and in this chapter I talk about, and in this book I talk about this in one of the chapters, the literary Socrates seems to deny the possibility of acrasia in the Protagoras, but if you look carefully at the text, all he does is deny it on the assumption of the common view that the good is pleasure. But if we acknowledge that the good isn't pleasure, then we don't have to accept the impossibility of acrasia. And this is Plato talking. This is
right.
Not the historical Socrates.
Right.
My hermeneutical assumption, and I expressed this at great length in this paper, which is on academia.edu, and in one or more of my books, is that Socrates is Plato's construction from beginning to end. It's Plato's philosophy, which is not to say that Plato didn't change his mind about some things or that his thought didn't mature or develop in some ways, although I think the broad outlines of the thought were in him even before I wrote any dialogues, and they're Pythagorean. But no doubt he worked out a lot of details with Aristotle present and with Eudoxus and others in the academy. And these are manifested in the dialogues. So.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question about the description of the book, and I haven't read it because it hasn't been released yet, but in the description of the book, let me pull that up right here. It says this fact, referring to the unhypothetical first principle of all being the cornerstone, has been occluded by later Christian Platonists who tried to identify the good with the God of Scripture.
Right.
I'm wondering, what in the world does that mean? Could you help spell this out and
Sure.
talk about what you say in the book?
Sure. In the Timaeus, Plato talks about demiurge and divine demiurge. And early in the history of Platonism, I'm talking about the Middle Platonists, non-Christian Middle Platonists for the most part. There was an attempt to conflate the good with the demiurge. All right, say they're one. Demiurge is one. The God is the first principle of all is a nous. But in the Timaeus itself, at 49c or 49d, Timaeus says, we're not going to talk about the first principle or principles of all here because they're not relevant to what we're talking about, and besides, you wouldn't understand. And I take that to be, as many people in antiquity later on after the Neoplatonists did, took that to be a reference to the idea of the good. And since he talks about the demiurge a lot, you have textual evidence there which strongly supports the view, in my opinion, that the demiurge is not the first principle of all. But we have much more by way of evidence, particularly when he says that the demiurge is the most intelligible thing, and what's intelligible is ousia. The demiurge has an ousia, he's an intellect, and the good is above ousia. So for these reasons and others, the identification of the demiurge with the first principle of all is a non-starter. This was recognized by Plotinus and ever after in the history of pagan Platonism. However, it was a very, very, in the early Christian attempts to use Greek philosophy to express Christian revelation, it was extremely attractive idea that the God of Scripture is the demiurge, because the demiurge does seem to have some anthropomorphic-like characteristics. He is good. He wants the world to be as good as possible. He manifests proneo, providence. He plans out the world, and he does all sorts of things for our benefit. And that fits much better with the God of Scripture than does a good, which is Iandousia, which is not a person, doesn't have real personal attributes. Okay, so there was a tendency among some of the early Christians, and then later in people like Pseudo-Dionysius, who was a student of Proclus, but who was a Christian, to try to once again take the Neoplatonic position, which conflates the idea of the good with the demiurge. Right? Historically, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's what Plato view meant. Certainly Plotinus and Proclus and many, many others saw the fallacy of conflating the two, historically speaking. But of course, if you start out with the inerrancy of Scripture or the revealed nature of Scripture, and you want a philosophical framework to express that in, whether it's Augustine or whether it's Aquinas or whether it's any other Christian Platonist, one way or another, you're going to give God a nous or intellect or intellection, right? And the idea that God made us in his image is going to have some kind of set of personal attributes. Okay, so what I mean by sort of misinterpreting Plato is insinuating a different tradition, different starting point into Platonic metaphysics from that which Plato and Platonists themselves embraced. That's what I meant.
Yeah, so I assume you're talking there about people like Alcinous who seem to conflate nous with the first.
Right. He doesn't seem to, he does. He calls, God nous, and the forms become thoughts in the mind of the God, whereas their thoughts, if they're even calling them thoughts of one misleading, but calling them thoughts in the mind of the demiurge is fine, but the demiurge is good. It isn't the good. It isn't the good.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, following up on that, have you ever thought about Origen and his relation? Because in his commentary on John, he seems to portray God the Father as being beyond nous, and he is
Right.
held or portrayed as a subordinationist by locating Jesus as the eternal
Mhm.
word at a
Right.
lower level.
Right. And of course, Origen was declared a heretic.
Yeah.
So some of the early Christian theologians tried to, they saw that the demiurge and God can't quite be the same. But okay, we have a Trinity, so we get a first and second person of the Trinity. That works all right because the Trinity, the second person of the Trinity can be a locus of truth. I am the truth. We have scriptural evidence, right? I am the truth. And that's the demiurge, and that's second. But this kind of subordinationism was ever after Augustine's De Trinitate was declared heretical. The subordination of the second person to the first person would fit fine within a Platonic framework, but it didn't within a Christian framework. So the early Christians' exploration of this, the other Christian theologians' explanation of this, eventually became to be rejected by Orthodox Christian theologians.
Very good. All right, Patrick.
Hello, Dr. Gerson. Thanks so much.
Hi, Patrick.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. I had a question. I stepped out for a little bit. I hope I'm not making you repeat yourself here. But I'm curious slightly about Plato's moral epistemology, of course, because as the idea of the good, it's the condition of knowledge at all, the condition of forms and their integrative unity. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the possibility of knowing the good and knowing the idea of the good, because it is the condition. Of course, it seems like the answer in Plato, as you've talked about, I know in Platonism and naturalism, is the answer is kind of the one that Plotinus has too, which is we can know it in a sense, we can know the one or the good through its effects.
Mm-hmm.
Is that sufficient, do you think, for knowing the idea of the good, or do you think it's possible to completely know the good? I know it's one of those classic questions, and I'm sure you go more into it in your book, but thanks a lot.
I would ask you, according to whom?
Sorry? Oh, sorry.
According to whom? Plato, Plotinus, Proclus, who? Because they don't have the same view about this. And of course, it's a problem, right? And the whole idea of mystical tradition is an attempt to address this problem. If what is knowable is intelligible form, and God is beyond form, then God is penitus ignotum, as Aquinas says, right? Completely unknowable. But that doesn't mean that we can't know God from his effects, right? As we do in abductive reasoning, okay? If there is an unconscious, we only know about the unconscious from the conscious. If there are neutrinos, we only know about neutrinos from the effects in laboratory, right? There are lots of things we only know indirectly by their effects. Some for physical reasons, some perhaps for metaphysical reasons. So the fact that it isn't an ousia or a noeton doesn't mean we can know nothing about it. Plotinus makes a distinction between knowing it and knowing about it. Knowing about it is knowing it from its effects, or knowing it by negation, right? The negative theology, which is in Plotinus and which comes from Philo and which is taken up in, throughout the whole Platonic tradition, knowing what God is not, the via negativa, is one very respectable way of trying to deal with this problem.
Thank you.
Very good. So we want to respect Dr. Gerson's time, but did anyone have any final questions? We've been doing a Q&A for about 45 minutes here. Eric, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me, Dr. Gerson?
Yes. Hi.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. So I'm Eric from the University of Bergen in Norway. I had just one.
I always want to go to Norway, very much.
Okay, well, yes, you have to visit us. You have to see the mountain.
Yes, no, I want to see the fjords.
Yes, you should come. I live in the west of Norway, so it's the most beautiful part. So
the western.
It should attract people, as you said, about the attraction of the beautiful.
Okay, well, anybody invites me, I'll be there.
Okay, I'll remember that. Okay, but my question was actually about attraction again. because you know, in the problem in the Idiot, Dostoevsky's Idiot, is that the kind of the beautiful or the good person, the virtuous person, is actually repulsive and attracts evil. So Mishkin ends up attracting the evil in the persons. They were better before they met him, but when he come there, he kind of, the rays of his personality and lights ended up making everything worse. And I thought about the problem of the, how do you address that part in Plato's ethics, where the philosophers actually are killed or they're exiled, or they can't actually, the tragedy of going back into the cave. That's my question. How do you interpret that part of the attraction, repulsion?
Well, you know, Plato addresses it in the speech of Alcibiades in the Symposium. Socrates' proverbial ugliness, but his beauty inside, like the Silenus, like the you know, the statue which inside is the God in it. So Plato was aware of this, and his ladder of love and his ascent in beautiful must acknowledge that people have difficulty proceeding beyond, sometimes even proceeding beyond the physical because of the appearance of ugliness. But it's the job of a philosopher to overcome that. So the interpretation is that once you've understood beauty, the ascent from the physical to the good itself, it is philosophy that is a guide to the elimination of misunderstandings in yourself and bad appetites and attachment to the sensible world. That's why it's a catharsis, right? In the Phaedo, philosophy as purification, not just purification of your soul, but purification, or even your body, but purification of your misconceptions about what beauty is. I think there's a lot more to say about that, but
yes, the poison of Socrates and so on.